Okay, so you could solve these tests, but in a terrible fashion. Can you think of a solution to this one?
Chop off your arm and leave it on the button. That way the door will stay open.
Yeah, that's not a great solution.
You threw the box through the window. Perhaps we could throw you through the window.
Actually, Tom, I think I'm okay for help.
Right you are.
The Turing Test. What if a game could make you think about life? Not just your life, all life.
Morning, Eva. We lost contact with the ground crew 450 hours ago. We have tried to establish further communications, but we are not getting any responses. We need you to investigate.
Okay.
I'm here to say that the Turing Test did that for me, and I wasn't expecting it. The title sounds like an attempt to embed gravitas into a mediocre video game.
Change these rooms.
I have a hypothesis. These rooms are Turing tests.
Turing tests?
Turing tests are tests designed to tell humans and machines apart. Typically, problems only solvable by a human. A combination of logical and lateral thinking.
Despite my hesitations, I booted it up and expected a short Portal clone that I could breeze through. What I got was a genuine surprise, both from the game itself and from the themes it presented. What I'm hoping to do with this video is make a case that the Turing Test has something unique to say on the nature of artificial consciousness and perhaps human consciousness. I'll be looking at the events of the game, its stated themes, and using other forms of media to justify what I think is a surprisingly deep expression for a first-person puzzle game.
This doesn't add up.
What does not add up?
If there was an accident, surely they'd come to find me, not try to lock me out.
My instance is still resolving conflicts. I expect they have their reasons.
In this game, you take the perspective of an astronaut named Ava. The game begins when Ava is awakened from cryosleep due to an emergency situation with her research team down on Europa. Tom, the station computer system, informs you that the team is in danger and that a series of events has occurred since Ava was last awake. When she arrives, she finds that the base has been reconstructed to present a series of obstacles that, you've been told, only a human can solve.
Go for launch, initiating.
The puzzle rooms have been removed from Tom's control, so they can't simply be unlocked from his remote commands. Why would the ground crew reconfigure their whole complex with the objective of locking out any non-human?
Open the door.
With Tom monitoring from her tracking implant, they head down to the planet and find the surviving crew, the cause of the emergency signal, and why the station has been reconfigured. So with our in-universe explanation out of the way, the meat of the game is to solve each puzzle room as the mystery unfolds. Each exit must be reached or unlocked. Basic elements are orbs, which act like power sources. There's sockets, pressure plates, switches. Orbs can also exist within portable cubes, which are inserted into their own type of sockets.
The crew are deeper inside the base, it seems.
The puzzles are engaging without being too challenging, and I didn't hit any difficulty spikes or uninteresting stretches where the mechanics became stale. What struck me right away was the amount of polish in the game. Without having done much research, I expected something in Unity, but here was Unreal Engine 4 in all its glory. Environments are usually pretty simple during the puzzle segments. Some areas give clues with environmental details. From minute one, the game does a good job of creating an atmosphere through its sound design. A voice in your suit helmet radio sounds very different than a voice from a recording playing nearby.
My purpose as the overseer of this mission is to work for the ISA. I am the ISA's feet and hands with a human. The machine being tested is said to have passed the Turing test if the judge cannot reliably tell which conversation is with a machine and which is with a human.
Do you think you'd pass the Turing test?
I am quite capable of polite conversation. Wouldn't you say?
During the course of the game, you find these recordings of discussions between research team members and Tom. Many of these discussions are about whether Tom is, in fact, a sentient being.
You simulate thinking. I actually think.
That is a very hurtful statement, Mikhail.
It's true. I can't hurt your feelings, Tom. You don't have any feelings.
Tom's usually the one that brings these up in an attempt to prove that he is indeed alive. The crew often disagrees with the defense that no matter what Tom can prove, he's still a machine running software designed to simulate human responses, emotions, and logic. These conversations serve to set the stage for the game's thesis, a thesis that becomes clear when examining the philosophical tests that appear in the game, how they relate to the events in the game, and may become even clearer when examined through the lens of other artificial life forms found in other media. First, I think it's important to establish that the standard interpretation of the Turing Test is that a human interrogator asks a written question to two different respondents. If the interrogator cannot differentiate between the two respondents, the machine is said to have passed the Turing test. The common understanding of a pass rating would say that the machine can think in the same way that humans can. Though this test is central to the game's thesis, what really fascinated me is when the game brings up Tom's attempt to reconcile the Chinese room problem, a popular refutation to the Turing test conceived in 1980 by John Searle, an American professor/philosopher at UC Berkeley.
So what was the need to send us here?
When the ISA discovered life on Europa, they deemed a ground crew necessary. The advantage of human field workers is that they can adapt to new knowledge more effectively. I, apparently, was not cutting the mustard. It is the Chinese room problem. A computer may be able to interact with new knowledge, but it does not know the value of that knowledge.
The argument postulates that no matter how intelligent a computer program appears to be, it can never be shown to have a mind, what is sometimes called strong artificial intelligence. The thought experiment goes like this. An English speaker is closed in a room and then tasked with translating Chinese characters fed into a slot in the door and providing the appropriate response back through the slot. The English speaker has a book that contains the exact instructions necessary for translating the Chinese characters they see into the proper response in Chinese. The English speaker has no functional understanding of how to speak Chinese, yet they provide the correct response every time. The English speaker is an analogy for a computer program and its ability to provide a correct response when given input.
In the Chinese room, because the responses you pass back through the door are the correct responses, the person on the other side of the door is convinced you are a native Chinese speaker.
Well, they're wrong.
Perhaps they are not wrong. Because with the instruction book, you are having a conversation.
But the person stuck in the Chinese room is not aware of the conversation's content.
This is the problem with the Turing test. A computer can pass the Turing test, having convinced a human they are having a polite conversation, while the computer has no idea that a conversation has taken place.
What if both of the people passing Chinese words are reading from instruction books?
There is no limit to how intelligent these responses can be, but they'll always be a result of computer program and not true understanding as our brains do. I had never heard of the Chinese room problem before this game, and I began to think about this concept as it applies to other depictions of artificial intelligence. Concordantly, how the physical form of that AI affects the external perception of that entity. Although this line of thinking may seem like a tangent, I think that looking at these examples in progression will be the best way to make my point about this game.
I may be a machine, but I personally do not believe I am stuck inside the Chinese room.
Right, you would say that. I could peer inside your databases at any time, Tom. Or pause your operation.
Do not assume I could not do the same to you.
Let's begin with an analogous AI to Tom and think about how this applies to HAL 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey.
The HAL 9000 computer, which can reproduce, though some experts still prefer to use the word mimic, most of the activities of the human brain.
HAL introduces himself as a conscious entity, but the sentiment is never echoed by those around him.
I am putting myself to the fullest possible use, which is all I think that any conscious entity can ever hope to do.
The 9000 series computer is said to have never committed a mistake, but when he misidentifies a hardware failure on the Odyssey, the crew becomes suspicious of his reliability. HAL was given a series of complex inputs, the behavior of the crew, and concluded that the mission was more important than their lives. Was this a conscious choice by Hal, a hardware-software fault, or the symptoms of an alien influence? In any case, Hal is depicted as a room full of processors. It's pretty easy to say that his brain is really just a complex series of programs running on those chips. It's pretty hard to imagine that a voice coming from a wall speaker represents a sentient being when you can see the entirety of their physical existence with one visual scan of a room. This, I think, is what Tom goes up against when attempting to convince the crew.
Do you believe that Hal has genuine emotions?
Well, he acts like he has genuine emotions. Of course, he's programmed that way to make it easier for us to talk to him.
What about a more complex example? The emergency medical hologram from Star Trek Voyager.
It would help if you didn't fidget so much.
Becomes part of the crew, has his own hobbies and relationships, but the majority of his behavior is defined by subroutines, and they often malfunction or have to be reinitialized.
Why are you making me stare at these things? What are you doing now?
I want to see if the data corruption is affecting your optical sensors. What did that do?
I can't see. I'm blind.
No matter how complex the doctor's behavior is, his brain is still physically located in the central computer core of Voyager, or the mobile emitter, and his behavior is defined by layers of programs. The Doctor was capable of rewriting his own programming, sure, but only after having been initialized for years and given several program augmentations. Without those, he may be as simple as any other Mark I EMH.
The Doctor has taken it upon himself to become a person who grows and learns and feels. It's made him a better physician.
An EMH program can't feel anything. Its emotional reactions are simply a series of algorithms designed to make it easier to interact with.
He's much more than that. And I've known him for most of my life. He's one of my closest friends.
You can't possibly believe that this program shares these feelings.
So, our two examples so far have been artificial constructs that require an entire room to operate. The Chinese room applies to them the same as it does to Tom. Here's where stuff gets tricky. What about Data from Next Gen?
Data! Chew!
An android with a human-like appearance, but his machine processes are only slightly obscured. His artificial brain is said to have positronic relays organized into a network capable of producing its own heuristic algorithms.
Its responses dictated by an elaborate software written by a man. Its hardware built by a man. And now a man will shut it off.
Measure of a Man attempts to prove Data's sentience. But when you think about the Chinese room, is he actually capable of consciousness as a component of life defined by Bruce Maddox?
Prove to the court that I am sentient.
This is absurd. We all know you're sentient.
So I'm sentient, but Commander Data is not.
That's right.
Why?
Data is shown to be a victim of his own programming several times during the show, which means he's still limited in the same way Voyager's EMH is. Data still falls on the side of machine when examined with the lens of the Chinese room.
Your response is emotional and irrational.
Irrational?
You are endowing Data with human characteristics because it looks human, but it is not. If it were a box on wheels, I would not be facing this opposition.
The room-size processing power is miniaturized from a certain point of view.
It's artificial?
Let's go even further and think about an example that gets as close to humanity without actually being human. A Nexus 7 replicant from Blade Runner.
I'm Rachel.
Deckard.
These artificial humans are genetically engineered and created from scratch. Their components are sourced out to bioengineers that have the ability to create artificial components so lifelike that the only way to establish their artificiality is to give them an empathy test.
You've got a little boy. He shows you his butterfly collection, plus the killing jar.
I take him to the doctor.
Despite being entirely human by most definitions, they are defined as artificial. Rachel takes over 100 questions, but she still fails the Voight-Kampff test. Is this a limit of their programming, or is it baked into the design of their brains? We can assume that Tyrell has tried to overcome this deficiency as evidenced by the pride he displays when Rachel takes the test.
I don't get it, Tyrell.
How many questions?
20, 30 cross-referenced.
It took more than 100 for Rachel, didn't it?
Does this mean they're limited by programming, or are their minds close enough to human to display true understanding? What can we say about a replicant in regard to the Chinese room?
The facts of life.
Like any good philosophy, there is, of course, a refutation of the Chinese room argument, and that's called the brain simulator reply. A computer could be so complex that its input-output would represent actual neuron firings in a human brain, thus producing the same complexity as the thing it's imitating. Searle insists that getting close enough to simulate a brain still isn't sufficient to produce understanding. It only imitates the formal structure of the brain, and a simple modification of the Chinese room holds the argument intact.
Tyrell Corporation?
Big boss, big genius. He designed your mind, your brain.
Even if their brains are exact engineered copies of human brains, replicants are governed by programming and, according to Searle, do not attain understanding. So what does it take to make strong AI? Is the Chinese room argument impenetrable?
Well, we know how to turn it on.
All right. All right. Legitimate questions about any of this need not be asked apologetically. If it feels awkward to be reminded that data is a machine, just remember that we are merely a different variety of machine. In our case, electrochemical in nature. Let's begin to handle this as we would do anything else.
I don't think there's a true answer, which is what makes the philosophical argument so compelling. Instead of an answer, I think we should look at this from the opposite angle. There's another philosophical concept within computer science that is relevant here, one that the game intends to communicate to the player, but is not explicitly stated. It's the concept of user illusion. It's mostly related to the operations of a computer system as it relates to its user-facing interface. An example is the visual aid of a desktop in Windows. The user is interacting with representations of functionality, but the actual processes are hidden behind that graphical user interface. Some philosophers have argued that the user illusion concept can be applied to human consciousness itself. Human beings, from a certain point of view, are nothing more than a self-contained system of extremely complex sets of chemical reactions which can interact with its environment.
Why does a lack of creativity stop you solving these tests?
Well, I contend that problem-solving is creativity. These human interaction tests are exercising your creative mind.
I don't see how problem-solving is creative.
Think back to the beginning of these tests, to the first puzzle you solved. It required you to throw a box through a window. Do you remember?
Yeah, I think so.
I simply had never thought to throw a box through a window. That is creativity, thinking outside of the box.
The human brain is far more complex than any computer and can do things that no animal is capable of, things like metacognition. However, the observable mechanisms within a human brain are based on chemical, biological reactions despite their unparalleled complexity. Human consciousness, therefore, could be the user illusion of those chemical reactions.
Can a computer ever be creative?
They can. But a computer's method of creativity is to try everything until something works.
We believe that something deeper is at play, when in fact, our consciousness could be the result of these reactions taking place in a specific order and combination. Likewise, a computer system, given a sufficient level of complexity, could give rise to the same type of consciousness due to the results of its input-output operations. The Turing Test, the game, is set on teaching the player this fact. A machine can achieve the same level of consciousness as a human mind. If consciousness is just the user illusion of chemical processes, the question becomes, what level of I/O complexity is sufficient? With the user illusion lens, sufficient complexity could be much lower than one would expect.
I have been trying to make sense of this gobbledygook, but it's beyond me.
So that brings us back to the events of the game.
I've started to collate information from my local instance. It seems the crew intentionally cut communication with the satellite.
Why?
It appears we had a disagreement.
Later on, the player learns that a discovery was made in the tunnels of this research station. It's essentially an organism that could enable any living human to stop aging.
The organism they discovered. It hijacks DNA. It endlessly repairs it.
Repairs? That doesn't sound like a bad thing.
It is indiscriminate. It will perpetuate all life, diseases, cancers. We have no idea what it could do to Earth's ecosystem.
Tom has concluded that this discovery would irrevocably danger humanity, and that in order to save Earth, he must not let anyone return with the knowledge of this organism. You, as Ava, work your way through most of the facility, but there's a great sequence near the middle, and it reveals that her actions have been entirely controlled by Tom up until that point. This is due to that implant I mentioned earlier. The player's point of view follows Tom's during this entire sequence. The player learns that they've been taking the role of Tom this entire time.
What is this?
Ava Turing.
Hello?
Tom is controlling you, manipulating your every step. We built a Faraday cage to shield you from electronic signals, to break Tom's control of your mind.
Tom, the artificial intelligence of the base itself, the very same machine that has been arguing its sentience throughout most of the game.
Ava, do not enter the cage. Ava.
It's been controlled by a human player.
What is this?
A human brain is controlling the actions of an AI during this story.
I didn't know you were playing me like a violin.
Ava, I am sorry that you are upset. We can work together, Ava, to search for the truth.
You've essentially bestowed consciousness upon Tom by taking control of his actions. We've established Tom as a room full of processors, the base level of complexity that we examined earlier in this video. Therefore, if Tom is said to have consciousness, surely we could say the same thing about Hal, Data, Rachel, and the Doctor, at least when examined within the context of this game. Every universe, of course, has its own rules, but comparing across media representations helps us to understand how we think about our own brains. If our most complex biological machine produces consciousness as its user illusion, and we've bestowed that consciousness upon Tom, since we're playing as him, we could say that within the world of the Turing Test, the complexity requirements for consciousness could be lower than Tom's. Where is the line? Hard to say, but interesting to consider.
Once we've shut you down, we're going home.
This is why the Turing Test stood out to me. There is something deeper than a ham-fisted attempt at making a statement about AI.
A warning shot. I will defend myself.
Maybe it's not what the game designers intended to communicate, but it did cause me to think about the philosophy of consciousness.
This is my mind. You're in my mind.
This type of revelation could only be explored in an interactive medium, where the game player takes on the role of a character. An RPG will usually let you choose parts of the character that you'd like to express, or in what way, but rarely do you see the interaction itself as an expressed theme. No matter what ending you choose, the game states that you have passed the Turing Test. Tom's actions were truly indistinguishable from that of a human being because the player takes on the role of Tom. Passing the Turing Test, in this case, is a foregone conclusion. Discussions regarding the nature of consciousness go far beyond what we've covered in this video, a topic that many individuals, many groups continue to ponder. I think that a game like this is noteworthy because it left a lasting impression, at least for me. Not every game does that, nor should they, but it is worth talking about them when they do. Going forward, I can say that I'm sure I'll consider the Chinese room when I see an artificial life form depicted in media. There are so many more examples that we haven't covered, and I think it'll be interesting to see if that thought experiment within a given universe presents a unique answer. Moreover, I think it'll be fascinating to see how those stories change as computers evolve with us. Will our biochemical computer be surpassed by an electronic one? Replaced? Combined? Sounds like there's a wealth of stories yet to tell.
Many of the darkness that must be shown away, for it is the dawning